In the North Atlantic, a research vessel holds position as it lowers a remotely operated vehicle on a tether. The mission is to document a part of the Titanic that has stayed hard to access, even after decades of expeditions. To show what's at stake, the visuals cut between what the ship looked like in 1912 and what remains nearly 13,100 feet down. If you want to follow the entry step by step and see what the cameras capture as they move into this cabin, like the video and subscribe to the channel. The research sub holds position on the seafloor while it releases an ROV on an umbilical. At this depth, stability is everything. One strong thruster burst can kick up silt and kill visibility for minutes. So the vehicle works with tiny lateral corrections, low power, and a steady standoff from the bottom. The first step is to survey the area and lock in reference points on the hull to plan safe routes. Distance and turbidity sensors are checked too, so lighting and exposure can be dialed in. Only after that does the detailed recording begin. The bow appears tilted and partly buried, showing how the forward section hit the bottom first and drove into the sediment. The cameras capture openings, joints, and plates under advanced corrosion, where the metal's surface has completely transformed. The survey stays slow to preserve contrast and keep suspended particles from taking over the light cone. Subtle ridges reveal how sediment builds differently depending on water flow and the shelter created by the hull. The goal is to map what still looks structurally reliable and what is too fragile to approach. Those readings decide where the operation can advance without risking contact. Along the starboard side, the vehicle searches for damage that matches a glancing scrape, not a head-on impact. Instead of one massive rupture, what shows up are bends and separations stretched across sections, with corroded edges and exposed seams. The camera holds a parallel line to the plating to reduce distortion and allow clean comparisons from segment to segment. The mission here is continuity, pattern, and context, not just the biggest tear. That read helps explain how flooding spread in a chain across multiple compartments. It also shows how decades of corrosion reshaped those edges and masked original details. The route shifts inside through a warped opening, where collapse has created slanted corridors and uneven passages. In enclosed spaces, movement has to be even slower because suspended silt gets trapped and visibility drops fast. The cameras reveal bowed door frames, fallen beams, and old cables, while avoiding any contact with fragile surfaces. Whenever a cloud begins to build, the vehicle stops and waits for the particles to settle. Navigation relies on a low beam and tight exposure control to reduce backscatter. This is exploration guided by safety and preservation of the record, not speed. In areas with stairs and drop-offs, the risk doubles: unstable structure and layered sediment. The vehicle rises and lowers only inches at a time, using side thrusters to stay level, steady, and off the floor. The camera documents bent railings, buried steps, and corroded edges, showing how much the interior was twisted during the sinking and the impact with the seabed. The goal is not to push through fast. It's to find safe gaps and document what still holds a recognizable shape. When rust appears with a sponge-like texture, the vehicle increases its distance because that material can crumble under turbulence. Every move is planned to avoid creating unnecessary flow. Near the bridge, the space is dark and sealed, and through the windows there's only black water, with no outside light at all. Instruments and metal framing appear heavily corroded, with sediment packed into corners and clear signs of ceiling collapse. The vehicle keeps its lighting controlled and the beam low to limit glare and backscatter. Then it backs away after spotting unstable beams, documenting the need for a safety buffer. Here, the focus is a command space as material ruin, with no suggestion of human presence. The sequence also helps confirm internal geometry before returning to less exposed routes. To avoid a repetitive run of interiors, the cameras return outside and reassert the scale of the hull in open darkness. The survey passes over collapsed upper areas, including remnants and bases tied to the 4 funnels, now reduced to structures and debris on the bottom. The pass stays high and slow to show deck extent and overall geometry without stirring sediment. This kind of shot gives navigation context. The operation depends on routes that alternate entry and exit as stability changes. It also helps orient bow versus stern and highlights the most fragile zones. Then the vehicle resets for a new internal approach. The mission shifts into technical survey mode, running straight, repeated lines to capture geometry and distance with precision. The vehicle projects patterned beams and tracks along walls and openings to document edges, angles, and collapse points. This builds a spatial model that supports future planning and reduces contact risk. The repetition is deliberate. It confirms measurements, narrows uncertainty, and lets passages be compared under the same lighting. Recording stays at a steady speed to support photogrammetry. At the end, the vehicle turns slowly toward a narrower, less explored route. The approach now targets a partially blocked zone, where beams and debris form a natural barrier. The vehicle cuts power and uses tiny lateral adjustments to find a secondary corridor with more intact sediment, a sign of lower circulation and less historical disturbance. Then it advances with the beam angled toward the floor, protecting visibility and reducing backscatter. The operation pauses at strategic points to let particles settle and prevent total image loss. At the end of the section, an interior door appears off the main alignment, partly obstructed. Priority shifts to stability checks before any close approach with the robotic arm. Facing the partially sealed door, the procedure switches to no contact inspection, a full sweep, gap measurements, and confirmation of maneuvering room. In spaces like this, the danger isn't only structural. Even slight movement can reshuffle sediment and shift fragile materials. So the robotic arm approaches first without touching, and the vehicle backs off to confirm alignment and clearance before any attempt. The priority is to capture the before in maximum detail, because the after can change in seconds. Turbidity and floor stability are checked too, to predict how the sediment will behave. If you want to follow the opening with this level of care and understand what changes inside, like the video and subscribe to the channel. The inspection returns to the partially obstructed door, where sheltered areas still look lightly disturbed. The procedure is to record first the outline, the gaps, support points, and the stability of debris pressed against the frame. Sensors measure distance and turbidity to estimate how fast visibility could collapse with a single touch. The robotic arm moves in without contact, only to confirm angles, clearance, and possible displacement points. Then the vehicle backs away and resets lighting to reduce backscatter and protect contrast. A fixed framing is chosen so before and after can be compared precisely. Only after that sequence can any intervention be considered. Before moving anything, the operation enters precision mode, a pause for particles to settle, then resistance tests with millimeter-level shifts. The goal is to identify the loosest debris and move only what's necessary without transferring load onto unstable pieces. Turbidity is watched closely because a dense cloud can cut the record at the critical moment and complicate retreat. Above, the support platform keeps the tether aligned to avoid vibrations traveling into the interior. The vehicle repeatedly confirms the same geometry to reduce positional error. At the end, the arm holds position with the tool ready, still without making the main move. The debris moves only a few millimeters, but the effect is immediate. Trapped sediment starts to lift and fills the cone of light. The vehicle holds station with short thruster pulses to avoid increasing turbulence. Instead of rushing forward, the camera searches for the first interior outline under reduced light and controlled exposure, trying to see through the particulate. When visibility improves slightly, the ROV backs off to let particles settle, then returns to the threshold. This is the moment the area stops being sealed. Water flow changes, and the interior begins to shift. The record becomes discovery and documentation of the impact caused by entry itself. Entry into the cabin is inch by inch, with thrusters near neutral to avoid lifting the floor. Inside, collapsed volumes appear, darkened wood, and fragments of mineralized fabric, all under low light to reduce reflections in the particles. The focus is texture, placement, and spatial relationships, with zero contact on fragile objects. Even so, faint trails in the sediment show that circulation has changed, and lightweight materials can drift. The camera turns slowly to capture the whole space before moving closer, creating a reference of the first state after access. Then detail shots document surfaces and fractures with consistent scale. After the first pass, the vehicle backs out and reduces water movement inside the cabin even further to let the environment stabilize. Documentation continues with no-contact measurement techniques like line scanning and angle shifts to reduce backscatter. Fractures in wood and corrosion around fasteners reveal what still has support and what could collapse under vibration or current. The floor sediment becomes a gauge. Small eddies show where vehicle movement still affects the space. No collection is attempted. The priority is controlled repetition of frames for later comparison. Maximize visual evidence, minimize change. With the interior recorded, the ROV returns to the threshold to frame the cabin and the opening in the same shot, showing what has already changed. Short lateral passes compare angles without re-entering and without creating new currents. Outside, the support platform holds distance from the hull so it doesn't drive water flow over the sediment. The camera returns to the frame and captures fresh marks on the floor and repositioned debris, proving a state change after the intervention. This is the transition point. The focus shifts from access back to the wreck's structural context. From here on, the route reorganizes to connect interior, rupture, and the final layout of the sections. The vehicle leaves the secondary corridor and moves through broader interior passages, avoiding unstable beams and zones with trapped particulate. Navigation favors safe clearance and controlled lighting, preserving readable edges and supports. Then it returns outside to reframe the bow, still embedded and tilted, confirming the forward section descended first. The exterior shot reinforces scale and orientation for the next stage, without relying on on-screen maps. The operation holds a steady altitude above the bottom to avoid lifting silt and losing visibility. This repositioning sets up the read of the breakup zone and the path toward the aft section. The external traverse reveals the transition into the separation zone, where the metal appears more twisted and irregular. The camera widens to show the scale of the rupture before moving closer to the deformed stern. In the aft section, the structure is more fragmented, with folds and collapses that form cavities and collect sediment. The vehicle runs short passes along the twisted metal without getting too close, keeping safety and image stability. By the end, the movement points toward the debris field around the stern, where lighter elements were scattered across the seafloor. The record continues under the same rule: stable mechanical motion, minimal disturbance, and a focus on visual evidence. In the stern debris field, control has to be even tighter because many lightweight items sit loose on fine sediment. The vehicle holds a constant altitude and uses micro-corrections to avoid currents that could lift silt or shift small pieces. The camera alternates wide shots to understand distribution and closer details to record position and orientation in the sediment. Near dark cavities in the twisted structure, sensors check distance and stability before any attempt to enter. The priority is to document what can be seen safely without forcing access into spaces that could collapse. With that assessment complete, the operation returns to the point altered by the opening. The second pass at the entry is done with no contact, only to record what changed after intervention. The camera holds on the frame and floor, comparing redistributed sediment and new marks that weren't there before. Then the beam angles inward to record the interior from a distance, without advancing and without generating fresh turbulence. Particle stability is observed long enough to confirm whether the space has returned to a steadier state. Outside, the support platform keeps the tether aligned to avoid transmitting vibration. The goal is to capture the after with minimal additional change, holding the same scale and the same reference angle. With final observation complete, focus shifts to the wreck's ongoing degradation. The camera captures layered rust, microfractures, and deformed joints, showing how the metal loses strength over time. In places, the difference between exposed and sheltered areas is obvious in texture and sediment buildup. When intact, the floor acts as a marker of low disturbance and low water circulation. These details help explain why some zones hold on longer and why others collapse faster. The operation ends this phase with shots that connect material, environment, and structural fragility. Exterior frames show the wreck as separated forms, suspended in total darkness beyond the light beams. The bow, tilted and buried, reinforces that the forward section descended first and drove into the sediment. The breakup zone appears as a band of irregular metal. The stern emerges, deformed and fragmented, with debris spread around it. The support platform and vehicle look small against the scale of the hull, underlining the isolation of the site. These shots deliver a complete view of what remains and what corrosion has already taken, without leaning on dramatization. Then the operation transitions into wrap-up and retrieval. To end the mission, the robotic arms are retracted and locked, reducing risk during departure. The support platform aligns the tether and holds steady tension to avoid sudden movement. The vehicle backs away in a straight line at low speed, verifying on the floor that it never contacted the sediment during exit. A final sweep confirms the route is clear and no unstable debris sits near the path. Before ascent, the vehicle makes a slow rotation and records the hull from a distance, with no further approaches. That final pass marks the operational end on the bottom. The last check of the entry is done from a distance with reduced light, only to document the site's final condition. Sediment settles slowly and softens some of the marks, but the opening remains altered and still visible in frame. The interior returns to a dark volume, with no new entries and no flow driven by nearby maneuvers. Light fades until the frame becomes just an outline, and the vehicle leaves the corridor without touching debris. Outside, the tether remains stable, and the beam pulls away from openings. The operation closes out the internal work and prioritizes return with no further intervention. Ascent through the water column is done with a rigid posture and a straight path, avoiding swings that could twist the tether. With the bottom out of sight, the only references are the umbilical itself and particles crossing the beam. Lighting is reduced gradually to control backscatter and keep a stable read of the environment. In denser particulate, speed stays constant and corrections stay minimal, protecting equipment integrity. The objective is a continuous return with predictable parameters and no interruptions. When the last hint of bottom light disappears, the abyssal phase is complete. At the surface, the research vessel holds position at night as the winch recovers the vehicle by cable. The equipment breaks the surface and is hoisted aboard with no people shown, closing the operational portion of the mission. Down below, the wreck remains where it is, but the accessed area does not return to its previous state. Sediment reorganizes and the opening still exists. The footage contributes to documenting materials, geometry, and environmental conditions, but it also makes one thing clear. Any access changes what was stable. As the lights pull away, the site returns to abyssal darkness. The ocean closes its doors, and what remains is the evidence on record.
This video recreated a historical atmosphere with AI, based on records from the time, in a dramatic narrative.